We're going to get started with this panel, which I mistimed. But as a result, to make up for it, I'm going to introduce all the panelists, and so we can get right into the content. As I mentioned, the subject of this panel is all about the future of backend development. And I'll just kind of briefly first reintroduce Ryland Goldstein, who's going to be our panel host. As I said, Ryland leads all of our developer experience roadmap and programs at Temporal. Please welcome Ryland Goldstein. I guess we'll do them all at the same time. Okay, I'll just run through them at the same time then. I'd also like to welcome Maxim Bovykin. Maxim is a principal software engineer at Indeed. He sponsored the adoption of Temporal at Indeed. It is, I'll just say from my own observation, an exceptionally competent wielder of Temporal, not just Maxim, but the whole team at Indeed. It's a pleasure to work with them. I also want to introduce Steven Sun. Steven Sun is, on the end, is a software engineering manager at Snap. And I could say a whole lot of things about Snap, but I'd say above all else, we're grateful for Snap for the degree to which they've pushed the envelope on scale at Temporal, and concurrency and performance and latency and everything about why you want to take Temporal seriously. So thank you very much, Stephen, for that. I also wanted to introduce Rob Zienert from Netflix. Rob has, if you guys follow the Slack channels for the community at Temporal, many of you will recognize Rob. He is an extremely smart guy and a very, very talented engineer. But what you mostly recognize him for in our community Slack is he's absurdly helpful and thoughtful and gives sage advice. And it's a privilege to have Rob on the panel. I also introduce Jessica Zhu from Watershed Climate. They were an early adopter of the Temporal TypeScript SDK, if I'm not mistaken, and they've been a source of a lot of great feedback there, and that is turning into one of our more successful open source investments in the last while. So thank you very much for the partnership there. And then finally, I wanted to introduce Leander. Rain is in a way a plant because she works for Temporal, but not exactly, because she only recently joined as a developer advocate, and she was previously at Cockroach TV, which more than qualifies to speak about the future of backend development. So with this in mind, with this team panel, I'm going to hand it over to Ryland, and he'll kick it off.
Hello, everyone. I'm super excited that all of you could be here and we could have this opportunity to talk about the future of backend development. I think that there's been a lot of different talks today that have kind of all gone around this theme, maybe indirectly, but all approaching it. And so I think this is kind of a session that can make it very concrete and take all the things that we've heard throughout, the amazing speakers' talks earlier in the day, and actually, distill it into some practical advice that hopefully you can take with you outside of this conference. And I just want to say that, you might have noticed that on the docket originally, there was someone named Rebecca, and I'm not a Rebecca. And so unfortunately, we had an amazing panel host, Rebecca from Common Room, but she got COVID very recently, so she's isolating now. And so I am the slightly inferior, maybe much inferior version of Rebecca for the panel, and that's why I'm up here instead of her. So today I really want to talk about what our goal is with this panel. And our goal is, to give every developer who's, potentially advocating for a technology or wants to advocate for a technology in their company, an actionable set of criteria and sort of, pieces of advice that can help them think through the process of actually bringing that technology or whatever they're trying to bring into their company. And I think, in order to talk about something like, an individual developer bringing in a new technology into their company, we should probably understand, how has this progressed over time? What did it used to mean to bring a technology into a company as a developer, and what does it mean today? And so before the panel, all the panelists and I had a chance to sync, and we kind of discussed, what was our respective roles throughout the history of developers having agency, for lack of a better way of putting it, in their respective organizations. And I think both Rob and Maxim, who are sitting to my left, they both indicated that they had some ideas and they had some experiences with the way that things used to be before developers had the agency that they had today. And so I think they're both going to share a little bit about that now. Maybe Max, you want to go first?
I'm going to go.
Rob first.
Bob. Oh, okay. Yeah. So way early in career, it was always the CTO that would wind up deciding what you were going to wind up doing. It was a declaration that you were going to use this particular technology, maybe because they had a partnership with, you know, their friend was over here in this one vendor and they want to like buddy up with them, and you were just kind of dictated what you were going to work with. I think it's a little bit different at Netflix. The way that it used to be was very much like a startup, and that an IC like myself was able to just kind of choose a technology and everything was bottom up. So an engineer could sign a contract for $300,000 and that wasn't that big of a deal. You know, things change, but that's kind of how it was. It's two different sides of the same past, but it's yeah. I'll just leave it there. Sorry, I'm nervous.
No, it's totally right. The top-down approach is a very common, especially in the established companies. Not necessarily when the CTO is the buddy with the someone. I would say that the bigger the company is, the harder it is to establish any sort of developer agency, simply because you have to work within the system. But as an engineers, we tend to trust our own technical choices. So a lot of times it's not about technical questions. It's more about the soft skills that no one talks about in any engineering communities. It's, okay, you've made your technical choice, and how do you surround yourself with like-minded people to turn this upside down from the top down to bottom up. I would also say that there are some extremes, like Netflix and to some sort of Indeed as well, where we're very proud of this bottom-up culture, but at the same time, it also can be our biggest curse in a way that every engineer is empowered to do anything, and that's a great thing, but also the worst thing is that because every engineer is empowered to do anything and choose any technology they want, it's very quickly becoming a chaos, a zoo. So the best way that at least we found within our company is to have guilds, how we call it, and no kidding, the Temporal guild is one of the guilds that we have at the company, is where the like-minded engineers, they come together and they build a case to prove that this is why we need this technology and this is why we need that technology. And it's where the bottom-up meets the top-down, because every guild is supposed to have a sponsor, like the senior leader sponsor, that makes the final signature, you know, on the check. So the moment that you prove that the use case is valid, that's when you meet your senior leader executive, you build your POC, you deploy it, and from now on, it's just a snowball effect.
Very, very cool. I think maybe the one sort of like wildcard question I would add there is, you know, hearkening back to when developers had less agency in organizations. Do you think that the average happiness of developers was also lower during that time? That's for you, Max.
Oh, that's for me. It is a tough question in a way that if you give an engineer like unlimited time and resources, obviously they will...
Is this a joke?
Was your question a joke? But it's like... For me personally, I always like to work within constraints. So the tougher the constraints are, the more happy I am. Simply because the less choices I have, the less headache I have in making any decisions. I will not try to say for every other engineer out there. Sorry, Rai.
I love it. So maybe just moving the timeline forward a bit. Rain, we talked before, and you know you've kind of seen this whole progression play out, and you know throughout your career. Do you maybe want to tell us a bit about like how things have changed? What does it look like as things have changed?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually much older than I look. I was I was working with LampStack in the late 90s, and back then it wasn't just the CEO who determined, it was that nothing else existed. And so you coded that way, and you learned to install the Linux operating system because it was part of the development process. You didn't have a choice to be front-end specialized or back-end specialized. You were full stack, and you weren't recognized as being special because you were full stack. You just were a developer. And I did experience, moving forward where the CEO told us, but it would tend to be more established companies that would tell the developers how to code. And frankly, I was happy back then because I didn't know otherwise. It was just, I didn't have the option of choosing anything else. So yeah, I was happy coding LAMP. And to bridge that TLDR all the way through the 2000s, because it's 2022, I enjoy a certain level of freedom. I agree with that. It feels like about 15 years ago is when people started looking at ICs and engineers as valid contributors and decision makers, and that's because so much more innovation was just happening in the tech world. And so I remember the first time I was asked what my opinion was, and let me think about that and get back to you. And frankly, since then, I would not go back. Like if someone stuffed me in a box and says LampStack from now on, I'd be like, ugh, my sequel. Because I come from Cockroach and et cetera. There's such an evolution of everything and so many options that it is overwhelming. So I do recognize both parts. I will say that I then went into the open source world with Red Hat, and I did start directing how things happened. The Red Hat installer for OpenStack is in Ansible because 3 of us started playing, and it was easier, and we could prove that. And it wasn't our managers who recognized that, because that's not how open source works. In open source, you have to convince the community. And we did. We traveled around and were like, try this, now try this. And they were doing the original bash, which was 7 pages, and then they would use Ansible playbooks and click, click, and it would work. And we were like, yes, could you tell my boss? And it happened that way. And to me, that's the best, of course. I'm a little biased. Yeah, so now it's all chaos, and you have to find a company that works the way you work, or found your own company, frankly.
And then use Temporal.
And then use Temporal.
So yeah, I actually want to move on and ask Stephen and Jessica, what the world looks like today now that all of this has changed. But I actually want to just say that, I found a beautiful part of, your comparison to the LampStack and now what you've kind of, where you are today. It almost makes me think about how people describe, like, thinking of being a kid again, where, there's all these rules your parents make and you don't really get any choice in them. And like, yeah, you could hate them, but like life is very simple. You don't understand the complexity of reality. And it seems like it's sort of the same trade-off in that case as well. So maybe Stephen and Jessica, whatever order you prefer to go in, I'd love to hear a bit about how things are now and like what does it mean that developers have agency today compared to what they used to have.
Yeah, so I'll introduce Watershed first because I imagine it's a company that not many of you have heard of. We are a climate tech startup building an enterprise climate platform for companies to measure and reduce their carbon footprints. And it's really interesting to hear about sort of the top-down approach of like the CTO's friend, because I think nowadays startups are all about sort of optimizing for developer agency and developer velocity. Climate change is coming, like we have to build the product that's going to fix it sooner rather than later. And so to whatever extent we can make choices that will enable our developers to move faster, like that is always a convincing argument. And so like sort of one boring choice we have today is we operate in a mono repo, which basically means that me as like a backend systems engineer can sort of make the end-to-end change from sort of like the backend data model to our server to even like serving it to our front end to make sort of enable that change for customers. And I think it is really about one of our values at Watershed is all edit the company, improve the things that will make your work better and faster. And so it's very exciting to be in sort of a fast-paced environment like that, where an individual engineer can have a ton of impact.
Yeah, I joined Snap 2016, and back then I think it's a much smaller company. A lot of developers can make their own decisions across teams using different tech stacks. So as company grow, they started making less sense. So we formed a better version of the team infrastructure. So that team, actually, the way Snap was operating was mostly on Google Cloud or was solely on Google Cloud at the time. But cost efficiency, we moved to AWS and Google Cloud both. So that was our main focus of our cloud technology. Open source was less of a norm to Snap. I think we have encouraged people to bring in open source libraries, but it goes through a long process of IP approval, security approval, lots of things, and then a lot of conversations, comparisons, and convincing of using a new open source technology in the bigger company is kind of hard. Also, in 2018, Snap started building out this service mesh infrastructure where everything relies on Kubernetes, Envoy. We have another layer of API gateway controls all the traffic coming in. So to plug in something like Temporal or Cadence at that time was pretty tough to apply to more teams. So we kind of start a journey as I have one use case, I host it myself, and make that use case worse. And then the developer agency thing has become from an individual push to word of mouth, basically becomes like that. And then more teams are interested, more people are interested in using this technology. And then we form a company level architecture review with a bunch of people and then start the process. And then slowly, the team's now moving to infrastructure team. I actually went to infrastructure team, build a team there, hosting internal temporals for a lot of teams. Of course, working with Ryland and Wenquan for a lot of extreme use cases in Snap. I think I can talk about this story posting. So it's powered by Temporal today. So that's awesome progress today. But it's a long journey. I think it's 1.5 to 2 years journey, bringing everything up. So it's less straightforward than smaller companies, I would say.
Maybe my last question, sort of a follow-up, because you mentioned it. Do you think open source is like really key to this increase in developer agency that we've seen?
I think so. I think the harder point for smaller companies, like the SaaS company today, we compare against those giants cloud providers, is still a harder battle. Of course, to be successful as a SaaS company, you need to have your advantage, your edge against those companies. So I would say today, of course, there's a lot of technology. I know Snap is also using M3 to improve their metric monitoring stack. So if there's an edge in the service offering, it's much more successful to be inside a bigger company. So it depends, I would say, yeah.
Very cool. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. So now we've kind of established, how developer agency looks today and like how it's changed over time. So maybe we'll shift it a bit to now to actually using that and leveraging that agency to actually affect change in an organization as a developer. And I think specifically when we talk about that, we really think about getting stakeholder buy-in and sort of getting people to actually buy into whatever you're bringing into your company. And I know it might seem like this was planned, but Ryan's amazing talk earlier, it was actually just a complete complete coincidence, but I think it's a very, very happy accident. And so, I think in terms of getting stakeholder buy-in, we actually did talk about this a bit, as a group before we did this panel. And there were some very specific sort of components that were called out, or common patterns that I would love to hear a little bit about. Some examples were like, what does it take to get a yes? Another one is farming for dissent, understanding what the no's are, doing due diligence around product comparisons and evaluating trade-offs. And so there's a bunch of different examples of what like a successful end-to-end adoption story looks like, and I think it would be awesome to hear a few different variations or variants of that. So maybe Stephen, because I know very personally that you're responsible for bringing technology into Snap. Do you want to maybe tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I would say to get stakeholder buy-in is simpler when you operate inside your team. You want to build a solution, and then you compare the technology your company has. You compare what you can use to build that. You do a design review within your team or within your work. Everybody happy, and then you bring in. You can use it. That's fine. When the problem space going to cross-org level inside bigger companies, you really either you have know somebody that's senior leadership got your support, or you have to basically use, as I said before, the word of mouth to really prove the value of the product that cannot be replaced by other products. Actually, in the arc review across the leadership, the engineer leadership, we have to list all the options we have, step function, simple workflow, Cadence, Temporal, Kafka, you name it, to really drill down on why Temporal has their own special advantage against those other tools. And then when they got alignment, and we got the resource, and we got the planning, now it's time to build a team to really split up the usage. And the usage split up is a different story. Maybe we can cover that later.
Yeah, so that's awesome. Maybe we can go down the line, Jessica, or if not, Rain. I think you said before you have stuff to add here specifically, but Jessica, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think even at a smaller company, a startup like Watershed, you still need to get buy-in, and your buy-in is typically from, for software adoption purposes, the engineers that you're working with day to day. And so what we really try to do is treat the adoption of new software like product adoption, so really focusing on what those use cases and problems we're trying to solve are. And so once you sort of have those use cases, you've talked to engineers with their problems, then you can pitch whatever solution after you evaluate all of these options based specifically on those problems. And so when we introduced Temporal to Watershed, it was really about two things. So one, some of our largest customers, Airbnb, DoorDash, had data that was sort of pushing our homegrown task runner at the time. And so sort of one sell there was, well, I can give you more observability, reliability with Temporal. But we also had to solve for the standard, typical median developer use case of you can write your workflows as code and TypeScript, and even though it's like a little alpha, a little beta, like we're going to push forward with it and see how it works. So really seeing the value of writing workflows as code, of reusing your domain logic in activities, because that wasn't something we could do before. And so really focusing on those use cases, thinking about like product adoption, like they are our users at the end of the day.
Yeah, and so, of course, I was hired on Monday, so I don't have a Temporal
Just for this panel.
version. I was hired just to do this, and then I have to leave. No, so my stakeholder experience is across 4 companies, I would say, is when I started being the person that started advocating for some specific change. And I just want to point out that what we're saying may work, and it also may not. And a lot of that is completely out of your hands, the resources of the company, the resources of your department, the resources that you have, because you might not have the bandwidth to do a POC at all. But if you do, if you work someplace that gives you like your Fridays to play, for example, and this is something, or your manager says, I would like to explore X, and you have that space, then I strongly recommend presenting to someone that you like and likes you first, because they will encourage you more than discourage. And if that first presentation is just discouragement, that can make you want to just give up right away. But if you are with someone who I'm totally assuming Jessica likes me, who likes you and you like them, awesome. We're friends. Hopefully they're the kind of person who is willing to also give you constructive criticism. And then after you have that iteration is when you then go and hopefully your company has a situation where you can support you can do a demo to the entire engineering department or to your entire department within engineering, basically to the people that you are trying to change something for, and receive that feedback. And then you take that feedback and you change. And that's when, to me, you start reaching out to the VPs and the people who would sign, unless you're lucky enough to be able to sign for $300,000 things, then, sign. But to me, please start with someone who can be friendly, encouraging, and also critical to move on. So my specific was that I wanted to bring in ARM hardware to an x86 environment, which is very different hardware, and x86 is very cheap too. So it's basically me saying, hey, can I spend $80,000 on one piece of hardware as opposed to 1,000? But I had legitimate concern that we were not serving a large portion of our community. 30% of our community actually built our operating system infrastructure on ARM, and were having to hack it themselves, and we weren't testing that. And so initially the answer was no, because it was upstream. This is $80,000 a system. I understand the no. So I started talking to people and just giving presentations and pointing out this is the data behind this desire, and this is the number of people then wasting time-ish and doing this. And finally, I got in front of the right people, which happened to work at IBM, and I realized IBM bought Red Hat, but even back then, you still had to convince IBM. And they were like, oh yeah, here's 8 free servers. And I never expected to just be donated those servers, but what I was doing was I was generating momentum using specific data. And I think that's what you're doing when you're building a proof of concept. You're basically showing, here's the quality testing. Here's how I'm proving that this is a good choice.
Rob, I think you do have things to add on this one.
Yeah, I'm going to go on the opposite side of what you're saying. It's always very good to build up your own confidence in what you're trying to propose and what you're trying to change, because without that confidence, you're just not going to be able to drive it forward. But once you've built that confidence, you need to find the people that don't like your idea, and you really want to get in with them and find every little bit of information that they do not like, whether it's actually logical or illogical. Getting all that information into you is going to be able to make your proposal even better. Being able to focus on the things that you never really thought about, like, let's say, oh, there's another orchestration system at your company and you're bringing in another one. Why are you doing this? Being able to dissect the individual reasons for why you're bringing in, say, Temporal when you have a system like Conductor, and being able to address each item point by point and what the new system offers, whereas the other system doesn't, really solidifies your argument that this is a new thing that is worth investing in. Because you can't just bring in a new piece of software willy-nilly. It comes with a lot of overhead. People overhead, cost overhead, And that thing, once it's introduced into your ecosystem, is not just going to magically go away. And the thing that it might have been replacing is also not going to magically go away. Like, we brought in Temporal to replace our own homegrown orchestration system inside of Spinnaker. That homegrown orchestration system is partially removed, but still very much alive and well, and we probably won't get rid of it for years to come. And so now we're dealing with two different systems, and this was one of the concerns that we had people telling us about. Is like, how are you, a small team, going to be able to manage these two different systems? And building up the advantages that we saw of bringing in Temporal as a developer productivity tool rather than just a reliable, durable execution system was very key. And we were able to quickly deliver through our proof of concept that, yeah, this does improve productivity in addition to just the reliability aspects that we were looking for.
Seems like another theme there is that it's not all or nothing, that progress in itself is very valuable because eventually you can get to where you want to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Max, I think you have a little bit.
Yes, I just want to add one more thing. All of the great things already been said. So, one of the keys into adopting anything is to make the people who you're trying to convince is to speak the same language as you are. And so, like for example, if you are a product team or a product company, the key for adoption would be something that sticks, but not necessarily for engineers. And with Temporal, it's frankly quite easy. It's like everyone understands what workflow is. So just say workflow and make them speak workflows, so it will be easier to make this adoption. If you are an infrastructure or a backend team, the language that you want your stakeholders to get buy-in from is durability, availability, and all that fancy stuff. So the language is the key before even talking about the technology.
I guess my last question, and we have like maybe 1 minute before we have to move on, is what happens when it doesn't work? Like, how do you handle that, like emotionally, when you try really hard, you do all the things you just suggested, and it just doesn't work?
So there's a balance you have to kind of find. Do you remain persistent in the face of opposition, or do you, find out why that opposition happened, and maybe it's something you can't fix, and they're right, and do you adopt? Or it's a balance, and it 100% depends on, do you have that free time to keep being persistent, to make it work based on that opposition, or is it time to let go? That's, yeah.
One of those routes sounded like being a workflow, stay persistent, keep going.
I agree. I think there are so many times when persistence is absolutely the answer. But I also think you have to take care of yourself and decide how stubborn you can be.
You can't keep going if you burn out.
Exactly.
Love it. All right, so we're in the last section here, and just wanted to say, obviously this is a super deep topic. If it wasn't already clear, we could probably spend a lot more time talking about it. So go find all of these lovely folks if you want to continue the discussion afterwards. But before we had this panel, we kind of went over 2 questions that each of the panelists could choose to answer, sort of about the future of backend development. Because all of this is sort of leading up to this premise that developers have more agency. They can now get stakeholder buy-in and actually push things through in their companies. So how can they use that to actually affect the way that software is going as a whole? So each of the panelists will have about a minute to answer one of the 2 following questions, which is, one key challenge that you think we need to solve for the next 2 to 3 years in backend development, or your ideal software development state in 2030. So if you were writing a bumper sticker for software development, it would say the following. Maybe we'll start with you, Max.
Yes, so what I would like to see is convergence towards silver bullets. And what I mean by that is it seems like the people in backend world now divided by 2 camps. The first camp is specializing in everything, like very special storage to support just a certain workload profile, or a very special solution to support just a single scenario. And the second camp is...
People who just work in resource managers.
Yes.
That's what Max worked in before.
That's me, that's right. And the second camp is trying to build a generic software and a generic infrastructure, like as generic as possible. And frankly, both of those camps are failing. Like for example, AWS, why I say it's failing, because when you are like new cloud developer, the amount of options that they provide to you is just so intimidating that you never know like where to start, what to pick, like SQL, NoSQL, S3, you name it, Aurora, Dynamo. If you don't know what you're doing, you don't know like what to pick. But if you know what you are doing, then inevitably you fall out into the first camp, which is, okay, I know what I'm doing, so I start specialize, and I don't know anything about like what's going on else. So what I would like to see solved for the future is, I would not say one infrastructure to rule them all, but a little bit more convergence between those two camps. If it's possible at all, I don't know. We'll reconvene in a couple years and see.
And we'll see. And that, 3 years from now at the next replay. Rob, you're up.
I think with Temporal, you get a lot of safety in runtime. And I work in delivery engineering, so continuous delivery is what I live and breathe. I would like to see that safety really become commoditized inside of continuous delivery. All the continuous delivery systems out there, or most of them, don't really prioritize true safety in what you're delivering. And we spend basically our entire time on making things as fast as possible and as safe as possible. And I think that there needs to be a lot more focus put in the industry towards that aspect specifically. Everyone's very concerned about shipping your feature as quickly as possible, but not really considering the safety mechanics of it.
Move fast, don't break things.
Yeah.
Rain, you're up.
Did you say move fast, don't break things?
I did.
Oh, I love it. I think the future is both much more complicated and much simpler. I think there are going to be a lot more options out there. Apologies to future self. There are going to be a lot more options. Like if you want to not know how to code at all and set up an entire backend, I think that's going to be an option. And I also think if you want to hack the Gibson from binary, I think that's going to be a real option. And I'm kind of scared of the future, but here we go.
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking a little bit to what Max said, I think we want to make sure that engineers are empowered to solve real problems and like solve the problems that actually exist, using like easy to learn, so sort of generic enough, but still robust for most use cases, so that we can solve the big problems in the world.
Okay, I think there's three things to make a backend. So I manage a backend team. To make them efficient, I think there's three things. Number one is setting up, how quickly you can set up something. It's either bootstrap that temporal worker or bootstrap whatever. The initial cost of setting up service is very high. The logic, takes less time. I think point number two is in the real world, you spend 20% time develop code, 80% time going through processes, stand-ups, and stuff like that, and set up tests. Whatever comes with that suit to drop your 40% development time, that's key. Number three, I think people are underestimating front end. So you have a backend system, you want to debug things, you want to look through data, you want to do whatever. Without a proper front end to help you do that, it wastes tons of your time every day. If you add up your every year, you an hour on debugging, that's 360 hours, right? So proper tooling with the backend, that helps much more the engineering efficiency. So I think those three was my,
Our front-end architect really liked your third point. Okay, so I know we're over time here, so we're gonna have to call it a wrap. But I really appreciate everyone, coming out and being part of this. It's a topic near and dear to my heart, so I'm really glad we were able to do it. And thank you to all the amazing panelists.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for having us.